Welcome back to the Jesus Stories channel. Today's new story is The Disciple Everyone Misunderstood, the true story of Thomas. Please support the channel with a like and subscribe. The content of this video has been carefully compiled from various sources, so if there are any missing details or inaccuracies, please feel free to leave a comment and share your additional insights. Thank you. And now, let's begin the story.
For nearly 2,000 years, one name has carried a reputation that few people would ever want: Thomas. The disciple remembered not for his loyalty, not for his courage, and not for his devotion, but for a single moment of doubt. Even today, the phrase "doubting Thomas" is used to describe someone who refuses to believe. But what if that reputation is incomplete? What if the man history remembers as the doubter was actually one of the most honest, courageous, and intellectually sincere followers of Jesus? The biblical record reveals a far more complex story. A disciple willing to die alongside his master. A man unafraid to ask difficult questions when others remained silent. A witness who struggled to believe not because he lacked faith, but because the claim before him was almost impossible to comprehend. In this video, we will go beyond the stereotype and return to the original sources, exploring the historical context, the gospel accounts, and the legacy Thomas left behind. Was he truly the disciple of doubt, or has history misunderstood him all along? Few individuals in the New Testament are as recognizable and yet as mysterious as Thomas. For nearly 2,000 years, his name has remained firmly embedded in Christian memory. But when historians and biblical scholars return to the earliest sources, they encounter a surprising reality. Compared with the major figures such as Peter, John, or Paul, the amount of direct information preserved about Thomas is remarkably limited. Much of what later generations believed about him emerged from tradition, interpretation, and church memory, rather than from the biblical texts themselves. If we want to understand the historical Thomas, we must begin with the evidence that can actually be traced back to the earliest records. The first fact is straightforward. Thomas was one of the 12 apostles chosen by Jesus. His name appears consistently in the apostolic lists preserved in the Gospels and the Book of Acts. This detail may appear simple, but in the world of first-century Judaism, it carried considerable significance. The 12 were not merely students or traveling companions. The number itself evoked the 12 tribes of Israel and symbolized the restoration of God's people. By selecting 12 apostles, Jesus was making a statement about his mission and the future of Israel. Thomas therefore belonged to the inner circle of disciples, entrusted with a unique role in the movement that would eventually become Christianity. One of the most intriguing details about Thomas concerns his name. The word Thomas comes from Aramaic and means twin. The Gospel of John frequently identifies him as Thomas, called Didymus. Didymus is simply the Greek equivalent of the same term and also means twin. In effect, the text repeatedly calls him Thomas the twin. Yet, despite this repeated description, the New Testament never reveals the identity of the other twin. Historians have no reliable evidence regarding who that person may have been. Throughout the centuries, numerous theories have been suggested, but none can be verified. The mystery remains unresolved and serves as a reminder of how little personal information survives about many figures from the ancient world. Beyond his name, the sources become noticeably quiet. The Gospels never tell us where Thomas was born, what profession he practiced before meeting Jesus, or what social background he came from. This silence is important because it establishes the limits of responsible historical reconstruction. Modern readers often desire detailed biographies, but ancient texts frequently focused on a person's role rather than every aspect of their life story. What can be said with confidence is that Thomas lived in a region shaped by powerful political, religious, and cultural forces. The Roman Empire controlled the land politically and militarily. Roman governors maintained authority through taxation and military presence. At the same time, Jewish religious traditions remained deeply influential in daily life. The memory of Israel's past, the promises of the Hebrew Scriptures, and expectations concerning God's future intervention all shaped the worldview of ordinary people. Like many Jews of his generation, Thomas likely grew up hearing stories of Abraham, Moses, David, and the prophets. He would have lived in a society where questions of faith, identity, and national destiny were woven into everyday life. It was within this world that Jesus of Nazareth began his public ministry. At some point, Thomas became one of his followers, and eventually one of the 12 apostles. Although the Gospels do not describe his calling, the decision to follow Jesus would have carried significant consequences. The disciples left behind familiar routines and entered a life marked by uncertainty, travel, public scrutiny, and increasing opposition. Following Jesus was not a casual commitment. It required sacrifice and perseverance. Another interesting feature of the gospel narratives is the way Thomas is presented. Unlike Peter, who frequently occupies the center of dramatic events, Thomas appears selectively. The gospel writers preserve only a handful of moments in which he speaks or acts, yet each appearance occurs during a significant turning point in the story. This literary pattern gives unusual weight to the scenes involving him. Whenever Thomas enters the narrative, something important is happening. Historians often encounter figures like this, individuals whose surviving records are limited, but whose influence appears substantial. Thomas belongs to that category. He remains partially hidden from view, yet his presence is consistently associated with key moments in the life of Jesus and the early Christian movement. This combination of prominence and mystery helps explain why he continues to attract attention after 2 millennia. Before examining the famous events that later shaped his reputation, one foundational truth deserves emphasis. The earliest sources do not introduce Thomas as a skeptic, a doubter, or a symbol of uncertainty. They introduce him as one of the 12, a disciple who chose to follow Jesus during one of the most complex and volatile periods in Jewish history. Everything else that history remembers about Thomas begins with that simple but life-changing decision. When Thomas first emerges from the background of the gospel narrative, he does so during a moment of growing danger. Up to this point, the biblical record has told us very little about him. We know he belongs to the 12. We know he follows Jesus, but we have not yet heard his voice. Then, in John chapter 11, Thomas suddenly steps into the story, and the circumstances surrounding his first recorded words reveal far more about his character than many readers initially realize. To understand the significance of this moment, we must first understand the situation facing Jesus and his followers. By this stage in his ministry, opposition against Jesus had intensified dramatically. The conflict was no longer limited to theological disagreements or public criticism. According to the gospel accounts, certain religious authorities had already attempted to seize him, and on at least one occasion efforts had been made to stone him. The atmosphere had become increasingly hostile. Everyone within Jesus' circle understood that returning to Judea carried serious risks. This was not speculation. It was a realistic assessment of the political and religious climate. Then news arrived that Lazarus, a close friend of Jesus, had fallen gravely ill. Lazarus lived in Bethany, a village located only a short distance from Jerusalem. Geographically, this detail mattered. Bethany sat near the center of the very region where opposition against Jesus was strongest. The disciples understood the implications immediately. If Jesus returned there, he would be placing himself directly in the path of those who wanted him arrested or killed. At first, Jesus delayed his departure. Then, after informing the disciples that Lazarus had died, he announced his intention to return to Judea, The reaction was immediate. The disciples reminded him of the danger. They recalled the recent threats. From their perspective, the decision seemed almost impossible to justify. Why willingly walk back into a place where powerful enemies were waiting? Why expose the entire group to such risk? The concerns were reasonable. Any ordinary observer would likely have shared them. Yet, Jesus remained determined to go. It is within this tense discussion that Thomas speaks for the first time. His statement is brief but unforgettable. Let us also go, that we may die with him. Few sentences in the Gospel of John have been interpreted in so many different ways. Some readers hear pessimism in Thomas' words. Others hear courage. Some see resignation. Others see loyalty. In reality, the statement may contain elements of all these emotions at once. Thomas appears fully aware of the danger ahead. He does not express confidence that everything will work out. He does not predict a miraculous escape. He does not attempt to minimize the threat. Instead, he seems to accept the possibility of disaster as entirely real. Yet, despite that assessment, he chooses to continue forward. This combination of realism and commitment makes the statement particularly striking. Courage is often misunderstood as the absence of fear. Historically, however, courage has usually been defined differently. Courage involves recognizing danger and proceeding anyway. The soldier who understands the risks of battle, the explorer who enters unknown territory, and the reformer who speaks despite opposition are considered courageous precisely because they move forward while fully aware of the potential consequences. Measured by that standard, Thomas demonstrates a remarkable degree of courage. His words suggest that he believes death is possible, perhaps even likely. Yet he remains committed to staying with Jesus. Another detail deserves attention. Among all the disciples present, it is Thomas whose words are preserved. The Gospel writer could have recorded a statement from Peter, James, John, or someone else. Instead, the first recorded voice belongs to Thomas. Whether his words reflected the feelings of the entire group or represented his personal response, they reveal a man willing to align his fate with that of his teacher. This is significant because it establishes the first clear impression of Thomas within the narrative. Before readers encounter him in any later episode, they encounter him here, standing at the edge of perceived danger and choosing loyalty over self-preservation. Historically, the episode also reflects the broader reality of discipleship in the first century. Following Jesus was not always popular, safe, or socially advantageous. The later success of Christianity can sometimes obscure the uncertainty of its earliest years. At the time these events occurred, no one knew how the story would end. The disciples were not following a triumphant movement backed by political power. They were following a controversial teacher increasingly viewed as a threat by influential authorities. Remaining within that circle required commitment. Thomas's statement provides a glimpse into the mindset necessary for such a decision. There is another reason this episode matters. It introduces a characteristic that will continue to appear throughout Thomas' story, though not always in the way people expect. Throughout the Gospel of John, Thomas tends to confront situations directly, rather than avoiding them. Here, he confronts danger. Later, he will confront confusion. Later still, he will confront claims he finds difficult to accept. In each case, he responds to realities as he perceives them rather than pretending circumstances are different from what they appear to be. This pattern begins in John chapter 11 and helps create a more complete portrait of his personality. He is not presented as impulsive like Peter, or as prominently featured as John. Instead, he emerges as a disciple who faces difficult situations head-on, even when the conclusions he reaches are uncomfortable. From a narrative perspective, the raising of Lazarus that follows becomes one of the most important signs in the Gospel of John. The event dramatically demonstrates Jesus' authority over death and sets in motion developments that will eventually lead toward the crucifixion. Yet, before any of those events unfold, Thomas has already made a choice. He has chosen to continue the journey, despite the risks he sees ahead. This decision forms the first major chapter of his story and establishes an important foundation for everything that follows. The historical Thomas first enters the spotlight not as a doubter, not as a skeptic, and not as a symbol of uncertainty. He enters the story as a disciple, willing to follow his teacher toward what he believes may be mortal danger. Whatever else can be said about Thomas in the chapters ahead, that fact should not be forgotten. His first recorded words in Scripture are not words of hesitation. They are words of commitment. The first time Thomas speaks in the Gospel of John, he reveals a willingness to remain with Jesus despite the possibility of danger. The second time he speaks, a different side of his personality comes into view. If John chapter 11 highlights commitment under pressure, John chapter 14 highlights something equally important: Thomas's desire to understand where events are leading and what Jesus truly means. This moment takes place during the final evening before the crucifixion, often referred to as the Last Supper. Historically and emotionally, it is one of the most significant nights in the entire gospel narrative. The public ministry of Jesus is drawing to a close. The atmosphere surrounding him has become increasingly tense. Opposition from religious authorities continues to grow. The disciples sense that something important is approaching, even if they cannot fully understand what it is. Throughout the evening, Jesus speaks about themes that would have sounded both profound and unsettling. He talks about departure, betrayal, future suffering, and a coming separation between himself and his followers. For modern readers familiar with the Christian story, these statements are often interpreted through the lens of later events. The disciples, however, were hearing them for the first time. They possessed no complete roadmap of what was about to happen. They were attempting to make sense of difficult teachings while standing on the edge of a crisis they could not yet see clearly. Within this setting, Jesus offers words intended to comfort his followers. He tells them not to let their hearts be troubled. He speaks of his Father's house and explains that he is going to prepare a place for them. He assures them that he will come again and receive them to himself. Then he makes a statement that becomes the catalyst for Thomas' next appearance in the narrative. Jesus tells the disciples that they know the way to the place where he is going. On the surface, the statement sounds simple. Yet, from the perspective of those sitting in the room, it raises immediate questions. Jesus has been speaking in language filled with symbolism, future promises, and references to departure. The destination remains unclear. The path remains unclear. The timing remains unclear. It is at this point that Thomas breaks the silence. He says, "Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way?" The question is direct, practical, and entirely understandable. Far from being a challenge to Jesus, it reflects the confusion that likely existed among several of the disciples. Thomas simply becomes the one willing to express it openly. The significance of this moment extends beyond the question itself. In many ancient educational settings, learning often occurred through dialogue. Teachers instructed, students questioned, and deeper understanding emerged through conversation. The Gospels preserve numerous examples of this pattern. Questions frequently become turning points that lead to important teachings. Thomas's question belongs to that tradition. He identifies a gap in understanding and brings it into the open. As a result, the discussion moves in a direction that becomes central to Christian theology. Jesus responds with one of the most famous declarations in the New Testament. "I am the way, and the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." The importance of this statement is difficult to exaggerate. For centuries it has stood at the center of Christian discussions concerning salvation, discipleship, and the identity of Christ. Yet it is worth remembering that these words enter the narrative because of Thomas' question. Had the question never been asked, the conversation would have unfolded differently. The exchange demonstrates how moments of uncertainty within the gospel often become opportunities for greater revelation. There is also an important literary contrast taking place. In John chapter 11, Thomas was focused on physical danger and the possibility of death. In John chapter 14, the focus shifts to destination, purpose, and the future. The change is significant because it allows readers to see another dimension of his role within the story. Thomas is not merely reacting to circumstances. He is trying to understand the broader meaning of what Jesus is saying. The conversation moves beyond immediate concerns and enters the realm of theology, identity, and destiny. This gives the chapter a very different tone from the previous appearance of Thomas. Rather than emphasizing courage in the face of danger, it emphasizes the challenge of understanding teachings that stretch beyond ordinary expectations. Historically, the disciples were facing a problem common to many movements built around charismatic leaders. Their understanding of the future remained tied to assumptions they had carried for years. Many Jews of the period expected God's kingdom to arrive in visible political and national terms. Jesus consistently challenged those expectations by speaking about realities that transcended conventional categories. The disciples often struggled to reconcile what they hoped would happen with what Jesus actually said would happen. Thomas's question reflects this larger tension. He is attempting to connect Jesus' words to a framework that still feels incomplete. The result is a moment that reveals both the limitations of the disciples' understanding and the patience with which Jesus continues to teach them. Another reason this episode matters is because it demonstrates the value of clarity within the gospel narrative. The question Thomas asks is not abstract or philosophical. It is concrete. If Jesus is leaving, where is he going? If there is a destination, how can it be reached? These are practical concerns. Yet, Jesus' answer transforms the discussion entirely. Instead of describing a route, he points to himself. Instead of providing directions, he presents his own identity as the answer. The shift is dramatic. The issue is no longer simply where Jesus is going. The issue becomes who Jesus is. This movement from destination to identity becomes one of the defining theological themes of the Gospel of John. From a narrative perspective, Thomas once again serves an important function. He represents the disciple standing at the intersection of confusion and understanding. His question allows the gospel writer to address concerns that many readers themselves might have. Ancient audiences and modern audiences alike often approach religious claims with practical questions. What does this mean? How does this work? Where does this lead? Through Thomas, those questions become part of the story itself. By the end of the conversation, the reader understands far more than at the beginning, not because every mystery has been solved, but because Jesus has redirected attention toward the central issue of his identity. As the evening continues, the disciples remain unaware of how quickly events will unfold. Arrest, trial, crucifixion, and grief are now only hours away. Yet, before the darkness of those events arrives, Thomas has already played a significant role in one of the most important theological conversations recorded in the Gospels. His question becomes the doorway through which one of Christianity's most enduring declarations enters the narrative. In the previous chapter, Thomas appeared as a disciple willing to follow Jesus into danger. Here, He appears as a disciple attempting to understand where that journey is ultimately leading. Together, these two moments begin to reveal a far more complex and compelling figure than the simplified image that later generations would often remember. The previous chapters have introduced us to Thomas as a committed disciple living within the inner circle of Jesus' followers. We have seen him step forward when danger approached and speak when important questions remained unanswered. Yet, neither of those moments would define the greatest crisis of his life. That crisis arrived in Jerusalem during the final days of Jesus' ministry, when a series of events unfolded with such speed and violence that they shattered the expectations not only of Thomas, but of nearly every disciple who had followed Jesus for years. To understand the significance of what happened next, we must temporarily shift our attention away from Thomas himself and examine the larger historical and religious world that shaped the hopes of first-century Jews. One of the most important realities of that world was the widespread expectation that God would one day intervene decisively in history. For centuries, the Jewish people had lived under foreign powers. The Babylonians had conquered Jerusalem. The Persians had ruled the region. Alexander the Great had transformed the eastern Mediterranean through Greek influence. Eventually, Rome emerged as the dominant imperial force. By the 1st century, Roman authority stretched across Judea, Galilee, and the surrounding territories. Although Jewish religious life remained active, political independence had long disappeared. Within this environment, many people looked toward the promises of Scripture and anticipated the arrival of a Messiah who would restore Israel and establish God's kingdom. The exact nature of those expectations varied from group to group. Some anticipated a royal descendant of David. Others expected a military liberator. Some envisioned a prophet like Moses. Yet despite these differences, a common theme persisted. The Messiah was expected to bring victory, restoration, and divine intervention. Against that backdrop, the public ministry of Jesus generated enormous interest. His teachings attracted large crowds. His healings drew attention across the region. Reports of miracles spread rapidly. His entry into Jerusalem before Passover carried unmistakable symbolic significance. Many people began asking whether he might be the long-awaited Messiah. The disciples themselves appear to have shared at least some version of these expectations. Although the Gospels show them frequently misunderstanding aspects of Jesus' mission, they clearly believed that extraordinary events were unfolding around him. They had witnessed acts they considered miraculous. They had heard teachings unlike those of ordinary rabbis. They had committed years of their lives to following him. Whatever uncertainties remained, they believed Jesus stood at the center of God's purposes. Then everything changed. Following his arrest in Gethsemane, events moved with alarming speed. Jesus was interrogated, brought before religious authorities, handed over to Roman officials, mocked, beaten, and ultimately sentenced to crucifixion. To modern readers, the crucifixion can sometimes appear as an expected part of a familiar story. For the disciples, however, it represented something entirely different. It was shocking, confusing, and devastating. Nothing in their expectations had prepared them for this outcome. Crucifixion was not simply a method of execution. It was one of the most brutal and humiliating punishments employed by the Roman Empire. It was designed not only to kill, but also to serve as a public warning. Victims were displayed as examples of Roman power and authority. In practical terms, crucifixion communicated defeat. It announced that resistance had been crushed and that Rome remained in control. For anyone who believed Jesus was the Messiah, the implications were deeply troubling. How could God's chosen deliverer suffer such a fate? How could the one expected to bring victory end up hanging on a Roman cross? These questions were not merely theological, they were personal. They touched every assumption the disciples had carried with them into Jerusalem. Although Jesus had repeatedly spoken about his coming death, the Gospel accounts indicate that his followers struggled to grasp the meaning of those predictions. Like many people confronted with information that contradicts deeply held expectations, they often interpreted his words through existing assumptions. The possibility of a suffering and crucified Messiah remained difficult to comprehend. As a result, when the crucifixion actually occurred, it created a crisis of understanding. The framework through which they had interpreted events suddenly no longer seemed sufficient. This context is essential for understanding Thomas. The New Testament does not provide a detailed account of his activities during the crucifixion itself. We do not know exactly where he stood or what conversations he may have had during those hours. Yet, we do know enough to appreciate the magnitude of the event from his perspective. Thomas was not an observer watching from a distance. He was a member of the inner circle. He had followed Jesus through Galilee, Judea, and Jerusalem. He had invested time, trust, and hope in the movement surrounding him. The collapse of that movement would therefore have carried enormous emotional consequences. Historians and psychologists alike recognize that profound disappointment often follows profound expectation. The greater the hope, the deeper the shock when events unfold differently than anticipated. This principle helps explain the emotional atmosphere described in the resurrection narratives that follow. The disciples are not portrayed as celebrating hidden confidence. They are portrayed as frightened, uncertain, and disoriented. Their reaction reflects people attempting to make sense of events they never expected to witness. Far from inventing a triumphant ending in advance, the Gospel narratives present a group struggling to understand what has happened. Thomas would have been part of that larger experience. Another important dimension of the crucifixion concerns its place within the Gospel of John itself. Throughout the narrative, Jesus repeatedly speaks about his hour, his mission, and the purpose for which he came into the world. Readers are gradually prepared to see the crucifixion not merely as a political tragedy, but as a central element within God's redemptive plan. The disciples, however, do not yet possess that perspective. They are living inside the events rather than reading them from the outside. This difference between reader and participant creates dramatic tension throughout the narrative. The audience knows that the story is moving toward resurrection. The disciples do not. They stand at the edge of uncertainty with no clear understanding of what comes next. As the sun set on the day of the crucifixion, Thomas and the other disciples found themselves confronting a reality they could neither ignore nor easily explain. The teacher they had followed was dead. The future they had imagined appeared broken. The hopes they carried into Jerusalem seemed buried alongside him. Before the resurrection could transform their understanding, they first had to experience the full weight of loss. That loss forms the backdrop for everything that follows. It explains the fear, the confusion, the hesitation, and the disbelief that will soon appear in the narrative. Most importantly, it reminds us that the questions Thomas later faces do not emerge in isolation. They emerge from the aftermath of one of the most shocking and consequential events in human history. Before there was an empty tomb, there was a cross. Before there was renewed hope, there was apparent defeat. And before Thomas would hear reports that Jesus was alive, he first had to live through the day when it seemed that everything had come to an end. The crucifixion left the disciples facing a future they had never anticipated. The man they believed to be central to God's purposes had been executed by Roman authority. Their movement appeared broken. Their expectations had collapsed. Yet according to the Gospel accounts, the story did not end at the cross. Reports soon began to circulate that something extraordinary had happened. The tomb was found empty. Individuals claimed to have encountered Jesus alive. Rumors, testimonies, and confusion spread rapidly among his followers. It is within this atmosphere of uncertainty and astonishment that one of the most intriguing details in the story of Thomas emerges. When the risen Jesus first appeared to a gathering of disciples, Thomas was not there. The Gospel of John records the fact in a remarkably brief statement. Now, Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. The simplicity of the sentence hides a fascinating historical mystery. Where was Thomas? Why was he absent? What circumstance separated him from the others during one of the most significant moments in early Christian history? The reality is that no one knows. The Gospel provides no explanation. No motive is given. No location is mentioned. No additional details are supplied. For historians, this silence is important because it defines the limits of what can honestly be claimed. The absence of evidence should not be confused with evidence for a particular theory. Throughout the centuries, countless explanations have been proposed. Some commentators suggest that Thomas withdrew from the group because of grief. Others imagine he may have been overwhelmed by disappointment after the crucifixion. Still others propose practical explanations. Perhaps he had left temporarily to obtain food, supplies, or information. Some have even speculated that he was avoiding gatherings out of fear of arrest. Each theory attempts to fill the gap left by the text. Yet the fundamental problem remains the same. None of these explanations can be verified from the available evidence. The Gospel simply does not tell us where Thomas was. While this uncertainty may frustrate modern readers, it also provides an important lesson about responsible historical interpretation. Ancient texts often leave questions unanswered. Modern audiences are accustomed to detailed narratives that explain motivations and fill in background information. The Gospel writers frequently had different priorities. Their purpose was not to satisfy every curiosity about individual characters. Their focus remained on the identity of Jesus and the significance of the events surrounding him. As a result, details that later readers might consider crucial sometimes remain unexplained. The mystery of Thomas' absence belongs to that category. Yet, although the Gospel does not explain where Thomas was, it does reveal something important about the broader situation. The disciples were still living under the shadow of fear. According to John, the doors of the gathering place were locked because they feared the authorities. This detail reminds us that the resurrection appearances occurred within a tense and uncertain environment. The disciples did not yet understand the full meaning of what was happening. Public association with Jesus still carried risks. The authorities responsible for his execution remained in power. Under such circumstances, unusual behavior among the disciples would not be surprising. Human beings respond to crisis in different ways. Some seek the support of others. Some withdraw into solitude. Some become highly active. Others become cautious and reserved. The Gospel leaves room for these possibilities without confirming any of them. Another detail deserves careful attention. Even while describing his absence, the Gospel continues to identify Thomas as one of the 12. This may seem insignificant, but it carries important implications. Thomas has not abandoned the movement. He has not severed ties with the disciples. He remains part of the apostolic community. The narrative never portrays him as a former disciple or an outsider looking in. On the contrary, he remains connected to the group. This fact becomes especially clear in the verses that follow. When the other disciples later tell him about their encounter with the risen Jesus, communication between them clearly continues. Thomas is still part of the conversation. He still belongs to the community of followers. His absence from one gathering does not indicate separation from the movement itself. From a literary perspective, Thomas' absence serves a crucial function within the Gospel narrative. The disciples who witnessed the first appearance now possess knowledge that Thomas lacks. They have seen something he has not seen. They have experienced something he has not experienced. This creates a unique situation that sets the stage for everything that follows. For the first time in the Gospel, Thomas finds himself dependent upon the testimony of others regarding an event of enormous significance. The issue is no longer what Jesus taught or where he is traveling. The issue is whether Jesus has truly risen from the dead. The distinction is critical because it changes the nature of the challenge facing Thomas. In previous chapters, he confronted danger and uncertainty. Now, he must evaluate a claim that stands outside ordinary human experience. The resurrection was not simply surprising, it was unprecedented. For a first-century Jew, resurrection belonged primarily to expectations about God's future actions, not to the sudden return of a recently crucified individual in the middle of history. The reports Thomas was about to hear would therefore require him to reconsider assumptions about death, hope, and divine intervention. The narrative tension begins building long before Thomas speaks a single word. Another fascinating aspect of this episode is how relatable it remains. Throughout history, countless people have found themselves in situations similar to Thomas, though on a far smaller scale. Others appear confident while they remain uncertain. Others claim to have witnessed something significant while they were absent. Others possess information that they themselves do not have. The experience of arriving late to a transformative moment and being asked to trust the testimony of those who were present is deeply human. In this sense, Thomas occupies a position that many readers instinctively understand. He stands on the outside of an extraordinary event, attempting to determine what happened without having witnessed it personally. The Gospel carefully preserves that position, because it prepares readers for one of the most important conversations in the entire narrative. By the end of this chapter, the mystery remains unresolved. We still do not know where Thomas was when Jesus first appeared. We do not know what he was doing, or what thoughts occupied his mind. The silence of the text remains intact. Yet, something far more significant has now emerged. Because Thomas missed that first appearance, he is about to become the only apostle whose encounter with the resurrection begins not with sight, but with the testimony of others. That distinction will shape everything that happens next. The missing disciple is about to hear a claim so extraordinary that it will force him to confront one of the most profound questions in human history. Can death itself truly be overcome? When Thomas finally rejoined the other disciples, he was immediately confronted with a claim that would have sounded astonishing to anyone living in the ancient world. The disciples told him they had seen Jesus alive. The statement was simple, but its implications were enormous. Only days earlier, Jesus had been publicly executed by crucifixion, one of the most brutal and unmistakable forms of death employed by the Roman Empire. His followers had witnessed the collapse of everything they expected to happen in Jerusalem. Now, suddenly, those same followers were announcing that death had not been the end of the story. For modern readers who already know the outcome of the gospel narrative, it is easy to underestimate how extraordinary such a claim would have sounded. Yet, if we place ourselves within the historical situation Thomas faced, his reaction becomes far more understandable. Before evaluating his response, it is important to understand the world in which it occurred. In the first century, people were no more ignorant of death than they are today. Ancient societies lacked modern medical technology, but they were intimately familiar with the realities of mortality. Illness, disease, warfare, and premature death were common experiences. People understood the difference between someone who was sick and someone who was dead. The disciples had seen Jesus arrested, beaten, crucified, and buried. Whatever confusion surrounded other aspects of the situation, the reality of his death would not have been easily dismissed. This context helps explain why reports of his resurrection created such a profound challenge. Thomas was not being asked to believe a minor rumor or an unusual coincidence. He was being asked to accept an event that stood outside ordinary human experience. According to the Gospel of John, Thomas responded with a statement that would define his reputation for centuries. He declared that unless he saw the marks left by the nails, placed his finger into those wounds, and touched the wound in Jesus' side, he would not believe. Historically, these words became the foundation for the popular image of doubting Thomas. Yet the label, while memorable, may oversimplify what is actually happening in the text. The question is not whether Thomas expressed skepticism. He clearly did. The more interesting question is what kind of skepticism he expressed and why. One of the most common mistakes readers make is isolating Thomas from the larger experience of the disciples. The narrative itself suggests a more complicated picture. The resurrection was unexpected not only for Thomas but for the entire group. Across the Gospel accounts, the first reports of the empty tomb are met with confusion, hesitation, and uncertainty. The disciples do not appear to spend the days after the crucifixion confidently awaiting a resurrection. Instead, they react with surprise when confronted with reports that Jesus is alive. In other words, Thomas was not unique because he struggled to process the claim. He was unique because the Gospel records his struggle in greater detail than that of the others. Another important factor involves the emotional context surrounding his response. Modern psychological research consistently shows that major loss can significantly influence how individuals evaluate new information. People who have experienced grief often become cautious about hope. Expectations that have been shattered once are not easily rebuilt. The human mind naturally seeks to protect itself from further disappointment. While we should be careful not to impose modern psychology directly onto ancient figures, the broader principle remains relevant. Thomas had invested years of his life following Jesus. He had traveled with him, listened to his teachings, and shared in the hopes surrounding his mission. The crucifixion was not merely a historical event for Thomas, it was a personal catastrophe. Any attempt to understand his reaction must take that reality seriously. There is also a deeper historical issue at stake. The early Christian movement emerged within a culture that valued testimony. Courts relied on witnesses. Communities depended upon credible reports. Religious traditions were preserved through oral transmission long before they were written down. Yet even within such a culture, testimony was not automatically accepted without evaluation. Witnesses were questioned. Claims were examined. Extraordinary events required careful consideration. Thomas finds himself standing precisely at that intersection. He is confronted by multiple witnesses whom he knows personally and trusts as fellow disciples. Yet the content of their testimony is so extraordinary that it demands scrutiny. The tension between witness and verification becomes one of the central themes of the narrative. Another reason the story remains powerful is that Thomas represents a position familiar to many people throughout history. Most believers who came after the apostolic generation faced a situation similar to his. They did not witness the resurrection directly. They encountered it through the testimony of others. They inherited reports, traditions, documents, and claims that they themselves had not personally observed. In this sense, Thomas occupies a unique place within the Gospel. He becomes a bridge between the original eyewitnesses and future generations who must evaluate their testimony. His questions anticipate questions that countless readers would later ask. How should extraordinary claims be assessed? What role should evidence play in belief? When is testimony sufficient? These issues extend far beyond the first century and remain relevant today. The language Thomas uses is also worth examining. He does not simply express uncertainty. He specifies the kind of evidence he believes would resolve the issue. This detail matters because it reveals that his position is not one of absolute rejection. He does not declare that no evidence could ever convince him. Instead, he identifies conditions under which he would accept the claim. Historically speaking, this places him in a different category from someone committed to disbelief, regardless of the facts. The distinction is significant. Throughout history, skepticism has taken many forms. Some forms reject evidence in advance. Others remain open to persuasion while demanding stronger support for extraordinary claims. Thomas appears much closer to the second category. The irony, of course, is that history would remember him almost entirely through this moment. The disciple who first entered the narrative, expressing willingness to face danger with Jesus, and who later participated in one of the most important theological conversations of the Last Supper, became known primarily for a brief period of skepticism. Yet, within the gospel itself, this episode is not presented as the final chapter of his story. It is a transitional chapter. The narrative is building toward something larger. The tension created by Thomas's response is intentional. Readers are meant to feel the weight of the question before witnessing the answer. As the chapter draws to a close, Thomas remains unconvinced. The testimony of the other disciples has not yet produced belief. The wounds of the crucifixion still seem more certain than reports of resurrection. The memory of death remains stronger than the possibility of new life. Yet, the story is far from over. The conditions Thomas has set now hang over the narrative, creating anticipation for what will happen next. The missing disciple has heard the testimony. The skeptic has stated his requirements. The question now is whether those requirements will ever be met. The answer is about to arrive in a way that neither Thomas nor the reader can fully anticipate. For an entire week, the tension remained unresolved. Thomas had heard the testimony of the other disciples, yet he remained unconvinced. The men around him insisted that they had seen Jesus alive. Their confidence did not diminish with time. Their account remained consistent. Yet, from Thomas' perspective, the claim continued to challenge everything he believed about death and reality. The Gospel of John compresses this period into only a few verses. But the silence between those verses is significant. 8 days passed between the first appearance of Jesus to the disciples and the encounter that would change Thomas forever. During that time, nothing in the narrative suggests that Thomas abandoned the community or separated himself from the others. On the contrary, when the next gathering occurs, he is present among them. This detail is easy to overlook, but it carries important meaning. Despite his skepticism, Thomas remains within the circle of disciples. He continues sharing life with those whose testimony he has not yet accepted. The disagreement does not destroy the community. The tension remains, but the relationship endures. It is against this backdrop that one of the most dramatic scenes in the Gospel unfolds. According to John, the disciples were gathered together once again behind closed doors. The description immediately echoes the earlier appearance. The same atmosphere of uncertainty lingers in the background. Yet this time, one crucial detail is different. Thomas is there. Then, without warning, Jesus appears among them and speaks the same greeting recorded in the previous encounter. "Peace be with you." The repetition is striking. The first words of the risen Christ are not words of judgment, explanation, or correction. They are words of peace. This theme has been developing throughout the Gospel, and now reaches one of its most important moments. The disciples are living in the aftermath of fear, confusion, and grief. The resurrection appearance begins by addressing those realities before anything else. What happens next forms the heart of the entire Thomas narrative. Jesus turns directly toward Thomas and addresses the precise issue that has remained unresolved since the previous chapter. He tells Thomas to look at his hands. He invites him to examine the wounds. He tells him to reach out and touch the place where the spear entered his side. The significance of this exchange is profound. According to the narrative, Jesus responds not to a question Thomas has just asked, but to words Thomas spoke days earlier. The conditions Thomas had established for belief are now repeated back to him almost exactly. For many readers, this becomes one of the most striking elements of the story. The risen Jesus demonstrates complete awareness of the conversation that occurred in his absence. Whether interpreted theologically as evidence of divine knowledge or narratively as a dramatic confirmation of identity, the effect is the same. Thomas is confronted not only by the physical presence of Jesus, but also by the realization that his private demands for evidence are already known. Historically and literarily, the wounds occupy a central place in this encounter. The resurrection does not erase the crucifixion. Jesus does not appear in a form disconnected from his suffering. Instead, the marks of the nails and the wound in his side remain visible. This detail is important because it connects the resurrection directly to the events of the cross. The disciples are not meeting a different person or experiencing an unrelated spiritual phenomenon. The one standing before them is the same Jesus who was crucified. The wounds serve as continuity between death and resurrection, between suffering and victory. Throughout Christian history, theologians have reflected deeply on this aspect of the narrative. The risen Christ bears the marks of his sacrifice, creating a powerful link between what appeared to be defeat and what is now revealed as triumph. Another fascinating question emerges at this point. Did Thomas actually touch the wounds? Surprisingly, the Gospel never says that he did. Jesus extends the invitation, but the narrative immediately moves to Thomas' response. Readers are never explicitly told whether physical contact occurred. This omission has generated discussion for centuries. Some interpreters assume Thomas followed through and touched the wounds. Others argue that the appearance of Jesus and his direct knowledge of Thomas's earlier words were sufficient to remove any remaining doubt. The text itself remains silent. What is clear is that the Gospel writer is less interested in describing a physical action than in highlighting the transformation taking place within Thomas. The focus shifts rapidly from evidence to response. From a narrative standpoint, the scene represents the resolution of tensions that have been building for several chapters. In chapter 4, the crucifixion shattered expectations. In chapter 5, Thomas missed the first appearance. In chapter 6, he responded to the testimony of the disciples with skepticism. Now, every thread converges in a single moment. The fear generated by the cross, the uncertainty created by absence, and the questions raised by extraordinary claims all meet face to face with the reality standing before him. The encounter functions as the turning point of Thomas's entire story. Yet the scene also carries broader implications beyond Thomas himself. The Gospel of John repeatedly presents belief as a response to revelation. Different individuals encounter Jesus under different circumstances. Nicodemus comes at night seeking understanding. The Samaritan woman meets him beside a well. Martha encounters him in the midst of grief after the death of Lazarus. Each person arrives carrying different assumptions, fears, and questions. Thomas now joins that pattern. His encounter is shaped not by curiosity or grief alone, but by the challenge of reconciling testimony with reality. The risen Christ meets him precisely at that point of tension. This helps explain why the episode has resonated so strongly throughout Christian history. It addresses a question that extends far beyond the first century. What happens when a person confronts evidence that challenges deeply held assumptions about the world? The answer offered by the Gospel is not merely intellectual, it is relational. Thomas is not persuaded by an abstract argument. He is confronted by a person. The resurrection ceases to be a report from others and becomes a reality standing before him. In that instant, the distance between testimony and experience disappears. The man who demanded evidence now finds himself in the presence of the evidence he requested. Yet the most important words of the encounter have not yet been spoken. The narrative pauses at the edge of its climax. Everything has led to this moment. The wounds have been revealed. The risen Christ stands before his disciple. The unanswered question that has dominated the story since the resurrection now hangs in the air. The only thing remaining is Thomas' response. And that response will become one of the most significant declarations in the entire New Testament. The encounter between Thomas and the risen Jesus reaches its climax in a response so brief that it occupies only a few words in the Gospel of John. Yet those words carry extraordinary significance. After the tension, uncertainty, and anticipation that have built throughout the previous chapters, Thomas finally speaks. Standing before the risen Christ, he declares, "My Lord and my God." At first glance, the statement may appear to be a simple confession of belief. In reality, it represents one of the most important theological moments in the entire New Testament. To understand why, we must look beyond the emotional power of the scene itself and examine the larger narrative that the Gospel of John has been constructing from its opening verses. Throughout the Gospel, one central question repeatedly emerges: who is Jesus? Every major section of the narrative contributes to answering that question. His miracles provoke debate. His teachings generate controversy. His interactions with religious leaders create division. Some see him as a prophet. Others view him as a teacher. Some believe he is the Messiah. Others reject his claims entirely. Beneath all these discussions lies the issue of identity. The Gospel is not merely telling readers what Jesus did. It is gradually revealing who Jesus is. This theme appears from the very beginning. The opening chapter introduces the Word who was with God and who was God. As the narrative progresses, Jesus makes a series of remarkable declarations about himself. He describes himself as the bread of life, the light of the world, the good shepherd, the resurrection and the life, and the true vine. Each statement adds another layer to the portrait being developed. Yet despite these declarations, the question remains open throughout much of the Gospel. Readers are invited to follow the evidence, observe the signs, and consider the testimony presented before reaching a conclusion. It is against this backdrop that Thomas' confession becomes so significant. His words do not emerge in isolation. They function as the culmination of a theological journey that has been unfolding since the first chapter. Many biblical scholars have observed that the structure of John's Gospel creates a remarkable symmetry. The narrative begins with a declaration concerning the divine nature of the Word. Near its conclusion, one of Jesus' own disciples directly addresses him as Lord and God. The opening theological claim and the final apostolic confession mirror one another. This literary design is one reason why many scholars regard Thomas' statement as the theological summit of the entire Gospel. The significance becomes even clearer when viewed within its historical context. First-century Judaism was firmly monotheistic. The belief that there is one God stood at the center of Jewish identity and worship. This conviction shaped religious life, prayer, and scripture. Against that background, Thomas' words carry enormous weight. The Gospel does not present him merely acknowledging that Jesus survived death, nor is he simply expressing admiration or gratitude. His confession reaches beyond the fact of the resurrection and addresses the identity of the one standing before him. This distinction is crucial because it separates the event from its meaning. The resurrection alone explains that Jesus is alive. Thomas's confession explains what that reality signifies. Another important feature of the scene is the language itself. Thomas does not offer a detached theological observation. He does not say, the Lord and God. He says, "My Lord and my God." The statement is intensely personal. The language reflects relationship as well as recognition. Throughout the Gospel, disciples have followed Jesus, listened to him, and learned from him. Now, Thomas expresses a level of understanding that brings those experiences together. The one he followed as a teacher is now acknowledged in a far deeper sense. The confession combines personal allegiance with theological insight, creating a statement that is both intimate and profound. Historically, this verse would become enormously influential in the development of Christian theology. As early Christians reflected on the identity of Christ, passages such as this played a central role in their discussions. Theological debates concerning the nature of Jesus would continue for centuries, eventually contributing to major doctrinal formulations within the Church, while those later developments extend beyond the scope of the gospel itself. They demonstrate how significant Thomas' words became within Christian thought. What appears as a brief response inside the narrative would eventually influence generations of theologians, church leaders, and believers seeking to understand the relationship between Jesus and God. The literary impact of the confession is equally important. Throughout the story of Thomas, readers have watched a progression unfold. The disciple who appeared in John chapter 11 speaking about the possibility of death now stands before the one who has conquered death. The disciple who questioned the meaning of Jesus' departure during the Last Supper now encounters the fulfillment of promises he could not previously understand. The disciple who demanded evidence after hearing reports of the resurrection now faces the reality those reports described. Every major thread associated with Thomas converges at this point. The confession functions not merely as a reaction to a miracle, but as the resolution of an entire narrative arc. There is also an important irony embedded within the story. Popular memory often freezes Thomas at the moment of skepticism. Yet the gospel itself does not leave him there. The final, substantial words attributed to Thomas are not words of uncertainty. They are words of recognition. The narrative refuses to allow skepticism to become the defining conclusion of his journey. Instead, it presents a transformation that carries both personal and theological significance. This observation matters because it highlights the difference between how historical figures are sometimes remembered and how the texts themselves portray them. Thomas's reputation was shaped by a brief episode of doubt, but John's Gospel places far greater emphasis on the confession that follows. From the perspective of the narrative, the destination matters more than the struggle along the way. Another reason this confession occupies such an important place in the Gospel is that it prepares readers for the conclusion that follows. John is not simply recounting historical events. He is guiding readers toward a response. The signs, teachings, conversations, and encounters recorded throughout the Gospel all move toward a central purpose. Readers are invited to consider the same question that confronted the earliest disciples. Who is Jesus? Thomas' confession provides the answer toward which the narrative has been moving. Whether readers accept that answer remains their own decision, but the Gospel makes its position unmistakably clear. As the scene comes to an end, Thomas stands at the center of one of the most significant moments in Christian Scripture. His words summarize themes that have been developing since the opening chapter and anticipate theological discussions that will continue for centuries. The crucifixion, the empty tomb, the resurrection appearances, and the encounter with the risen Christ all converge in a single declaration. In only 5 words, Thomas articulates what the Gospel of John has been building toward from the very beginning. My Lord and my God. It is not merely the conclusion of Thomas' story, it is one of the defining conclusions of the Gospel itself. With Thomas' confession now complete, the Gospel of John introduces one final statement from Jesus that expands the significance of the entire episode far beyond the walls of that room. Up to this point, The story has focused primarily on a single disciple and his encounter with the risen Christ, but the audience of the Gospel is much larger than Thomas alone. By the time John was written, Christian communities already existed across different parts of the Roman world. Most believers had never seen Jesus with their own eyes. They had not stood beside the Sea of Galilee. They had not witnessed the crucifixion. They had not entered the empty tomb. Their understanding of these events depended entirely upon the testimony of others. It is precisely to this larger audience that Jesus now directs his attention, after Thomas's confession. He says, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." These words have become some of the most discussed verses in the New Testament because they raise an important question. What relationship does Christianity establish between faith and evidence? At first glance, some readers assume that Jesus is criticizing Thomas and praising belief without evidence. According to this interpretation, faith becomes valuable precisely because it ignores proof. Yet, when the statement is examined within the broader context of John's Gospel, that conclusion becomes difficult to maintain. Throughout the narrative, evidence plays an important role. The Gospel repeatedly points readers toward signs, witnesses, events, and testimony intended to support belief. The turning of water into wine, the healing of the blind man, the feeding of the multitude, and the raising of Lazarus are all presented as public acts with theological significance. John does not portray faith as emerging from a vacuum. Instead, faith develops in response to things that are seen, heard, and experienced. This pattern becomes even clearer near the conclusion of the Gospel. Immediately after the story of Thomas, John explains why he wrote the book in the first place. He states that Jesus performed many other signs not recorded in the text, but that those included were written so that readers might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. In other words, the Gospel itself functions as evidence. It presents testimony from eyewitness traditions and invites readers to evaluate what they have read. This observation is critical because it changes how Jesus' words are understood. The contrast is not between evidence and faith. The contrast is between direct sight and mediated testimony. Thomas saw the risen Christ personally. Future generations would encounter him through the witness of those who had seen him. This distinction places Thomas in a unique position within the history of Christianity. He belongs to the generation of eyewitnesses. Yet his experience also resembles that of later believers. Before seeing Jesus, he relied upon the reports of others. In that sense, he becomes a bridge between two worlds. On one side stand those who physically witness the events. On the other stand those who must assess those events through testimony preserved in memory. Preaching and written texts. The story, therefore, becomes much larger than a single disciple's reaction. It becomes a reflection on how religious belief is transmitted across generations. Historically, this issue was enormously important for the early Christian movement. Christianity expanded rapidly throughout regions where most people had never met Jesus and never could. The message spread through travelers, missionaries, teachers, and communities. New believers encountered the gospel not through direct observation, but through reports delivered by others. This reality forced early Christians to think carefully about witness, credibility, and trust. The concept of testimony occupied a central place in ancient societies. Courts relied on witnesses. Historical accounts depended upon eyewitness reports. Communities preserved collective memory through oral transmission long before widespread literacy became common. The New Testament emerged within that world. Its authors consistently appealed to witness as a means of establishing credibility. The resurrection narratives themselves reflect this concern. Multiple individuals and groups are described as encountering the risen Christ, creating a network of testimony that became foundational to Christian proclamation. There is also a broader human dimension to this discussion. Much of what people know about the world comes through trusted sources rather than direct observation. Few individuals personally verify every historical event they accept as true. Most people have never witnessed the construction of ancient monuments, observed distant scientific discoveries firsthand, or seen many of the events described in history books. Knowledge often depends upon evaluating the reliability of testimony, evidence, and sources. The issue is not whether people trust testimony. The issue is which testimony they consider trustworthy. The Gospel of John operates within that reality. It presents itself as a witness account and asks readers to consider its claims. This perspective helps explain why the Thomas narrative has remained so relevant for centuries. The story addresses a challenge familiar to every generation. How should individuals respond to events they did not personally witness? What level of confidence can be placed in historical testimony? How should extraordinary claims be evaluated? These questions are not limited to theology. They arise in history, law, science, and everyday life. The Gospel does not eliminate these questions. Instead, it places them within the framework of witness and response. Readers are invited to examine the testimony presented and determine what conclusions they find reasonable. Another important observation concerns the nature of faith itself. In popular discussion, faith is sometimes portrayed as belief without reason or confidence without foundation. Yet the New Testament often presents a more complex picture. Faith involves trust, but trust is frequently connected to testimony, experience, and evidence. The disciples trusted Jesus because of what they had seen and heard throughout his ministry. The early Christian communities trusted apostolic testimony because they regarded the witnesses as credible. The Gospel of John seeks to inspire belief by presenting reasons for belief. Within this framework, faith is not the rejection of evidence. It is the response that follows when evidence and testimony are judged worthy of trust. The statement Jesus makes after Thomas' confession therefore serves as a transition from the apostolic era to the generations that follow. The eyewitnesses will not remain forever. Future believers will inherit their testimony through preaching and scripture. The blessing pronounced by Jesus acknowledges that reality. It speaks directly to everyone who must grapple with the resurrection through the witness of others. In many ways, that includes nearly every reader of the Gospel. Thomas's story began as a personal struggle with an extraordinary claim. It ends as a reflection on how all future generations will encounter that same claim. The focus shifts from one disciple's experience to the broader question of how belief is formed and sustained across time. By the end of the chapter, Thomas himself almost disappears from view. The conversation now concerns something larger than his individual journey. The Gospel turns toward its readers and asks them to consider the same evidence, testimony, and witness that confronted the earliest followers of Jesus. The question is no longer simply what Thomas believed. The question is what future generations will do with the testimony he and the other apostles leave behind. With the conclusion of the resurrection narrative, Thomas largely disappears from the pages of the New Testament. After his confession in the Gospel of John, he receives only brief mentions in the biblical record. Like several of the other apostles, he suddenly moves from the center of the story into the shadows of history. Yet, for many viewers, this is where a new question naturally emerges. What happened next? What became of Thomas after the resurrection? Did he continue preaching? Did he travel beyond Judea? How did later generations remember him? Answering those questions requires leaving the world of Scripture and entering a more complicated landscape where history, tradition, theology, and legend often intersect. This transition is important Because not all sources carry the same historical weight, the New Testament remains the earliest and most authoritative source for the life of Thomas. Once we move beyond it, certainty becomes more difficult. Historians must evaluate later traditions carefully, distinguishing between what can be established with reasonable confidence and what remains speculative. The challenge is not unique to Thomas. It applies to many figures from the ancient world whose lives are only partially documented. In the case of Thomas, however, the situation is especially interesting because his post-biblical legacy became remarkably extensive, stretching far beyond the geographical boundaries of the Roman Empire. One of the oldest and most persistent traditions associated with Thomas connects him to the spread of Christianity toward the East. While much of early Christian history focuses on the Mediterranean world, trade networks during the 1st century extended far beyond those regions. Roman merchants traveled through Egypt and across the Red Sea. Commercial routes linked the Mediterranean with Arabia, Persia, and the western coast of India. Archaeological discoveries, including Roman coins and imported goods found in India, confirm that long-distance trade between these regions was already well established during the 1st century. This historical backdrop is significant because it demonstrates that travel between the Near East and India was not impossible or extraordinary. The routes existed. Merchants used them regularly. Ideas, cultures, and religious beliefs moved along the same pathways. Within this context emerged the tradition that Thomas journeyed eastward as a missionary. According to ancient Christian communities in India, the apostle arrived on the Malabar coast and participated in the founding of churches that would survive for centuries. These communities became known as St. Thomas Christians and remain one of the oldest Christian traditions in the world. Their existence is historically important because it demonstrates that the association between Thomas and India is not a modern invention. The tradition has deep roots and was preserved across generations long before the modern era. At the same time, historians approach the question carefully. The existence of an ancient tradition does not automatically prove every detail associated with it. The evidence allows scholars to say that early Christian communities strongly connected their origins to Thomas, but the precise historical details remain difficult to verify with certainty. As a result, responsible scholarship usually avoids both extremes. It neither dismisses the tradition outright, nor treats every element as established fact. Another major source connected to Thomas is a document known as the Acts of Thomas. Written centuries after the events it describes, this text presents a detailed account of Thomas's missionary activities, particularly in India. The narrative includes dramatic journeys, miraculous events, speeches, conversions, and episodes designed to inspire readers. For historians, the Acts of Thomas is a fascinating document, but not primarily because it provides a straightforward biography of the apostle. Its greatest value lies in revealing how later Christian communities understood Thomas and the role they believed he played in the spread of the faith. Like many ancient religious writings, it combines historical memory with theological storytelling. The result is a text that illuminates the development of Christian tradition, even when individual details cannot be independently confirmed. A second document associated with Thomas would become even more famous in modern scholarship, known as the Gospel of Thomas. It gained widespread attention after the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt during the 20th century. The title naturally attracts curiosity because many people assume it was written by the apostle himself. Yet the majority of scholars reject that conclusion. Most researchers date the text significantly later than the lifetime of Thomas, and view it as the product of a different theological environment from the canonical Gospels. Unlike Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospel of Thomas contains very little narrative structure. Instead, It consists primarily of sayings attributed to Jesus. Some of those sayings resemble material found in the New Testament. Others differ substantially in tone and content. The document remains valuable for understanding the diversity of early Christian thought, but it does not function as an alternative eyewitness biography of Thomas. Its importance lies in what it reveals about later religious movements and theological developments, rather than in providing direct historical access to the apostle himself. Another enduring element of Thomas' legacy concerns his death. Various traditions describe him as a martyr who remained active in missionary work until the end of his life. The specific details differ across sources, making historical verification difficult. Some accounts place his death in India. Others preserve variations of the story. What remains consistent, however, is the image of Thomas as a missionary figure whose influence extended beyond the lands described in the New Testament. Whether every detail can be confirmed or not, this image became deeply embedded within Christian memory. For centuries, believers remembered Thomas not as a disciple defined by a single moment of uncertainty, but as an apostle associated with courage, travel, perseverance, and the spread of the gospel into new territories. There is a broader historical lesson hidden within these traditions. Ancient communities often preserved memories through storytelling, liturgy, and collective identity. Over time, historical events and devotional reflection frequently became intertwined. This process occurred across many religious and cultural traditions, not only within Christianity. Understanding this dynamic helps modern readers appreciate both the value and the limitations of post-biblical sources. These traditions may preserve authentic historical memories, but they also reflect the hopes, beliefs, and theological interests of the communities that transmitted them. For that reason, historians examine them carefully rather than accepting or rejecting them wholesale. By the end of this investigation, a fascinating picture emerges. The biblical Thomas remains a figure whose direct appearances are relatively few, yet his influence extends far beyond those pages. Ancient trade routes, missionary traditions, early Christian literature, and enduring communities all contributed to a legacy that spread across continents. Whether viewed through the lens of history, tradition, or religious memory, Thomas became associated with movement beyond familiar boundaries. The disciple who once stood in Jerusalem confronting the question of resurrection eventually became linked to stories that carried his name to distant parts of the world. While many details remain uncertain, one conclusion is difficult to ignore. Thomas' story did not end with the Gospel of John. In many ways, that story was only beginning. Long after the biblical narrative fell silent, communities across the ancient world continued to remember, interpret, and preserve the legacy of the apostle, whose name would endure for nearly 2,000 years. As we reach the end of Thomas' story, an interesting contrast begins to emerge between popular memory and the biblical record itself. For centuries, one image has dominated the way many people think about Thomas. He is remembered as the disciple who doubted. His name became attached to a phrase recognized far beyond Christian circles. Even people with little knowledge of the New Testament often understand the expression, doubting Thomas. Yet, when we step back and examine the entire narrative, a different picture comes into focus. The historical Thomas preserved in the Gospel accounts cannot be reduced to a single moment. In fact, one of the most striking discoveries in this journey is how little of his actual story is devoted to the episode that eventually defined his reputation. The Gospel of John presents Thomas at several critical moments, and each appearance contributes something unique to his character. When he first speaks, he appears during a dangerous moment in Jesus' ministry and expressed willingness to follow despite the risks ahead. Later, during the final evening before the crucifixion, He participates in a conversation that leads to one of the most important theological statements in the New Testament. After the resurrection, he becomes the central figure in a narrative exploring testimony, evidence, and belief, taken together. These episodes reveal a far more complex individual than the simplified image preserved by popular tradition. Rather than presenting a man defined by one trait, the Gospel presents a disciple whose story unfolds through a series of pivotal encounters. Another important observation concerns the role Thomas plays within the structure of John's Gospel. Not every disciple serves the same narrative function. Peter often appears as a leader. John is frequently portrayed as a close witness to key events. Thomas occupies a different position, again and again. He appears at moments when major theological themes are being explored. In John chapter 11, the focus is the approach of danger and death. In John chapter 14, the discussion centers on the identity of Jesus and the path to the Father. In John chapter 20, the narrative turns to resurrection, testimony, and belief. Thomas consistently appears when the Gospel is addressing some of its most important questions. This pattern suggests that his significance extends beyond the details of his personal biography. He becomes a literary and theological figure through whom the Gospel examines issues that would remain relevant for generations of readers. The story also illustrates how historical memory is often selective. Human beings naturally simplify complex individuals. Historical figures become associated with particular events, phrases, or characteristics that overshadow everything else. This process occurs across cultures and throughout history. A single episode can become so memorable that it eclipses an entire lifetime. Thomas experienced precisely this phenomenon. The episode of his skepticism became famous because it touched a question many people continue to ask. How should extraordinary claims be evaluated? What role should evidence play in belief? The enduring relevance of those questions ensured that Thomas' experience would remain memorable. Yet, the popularity of that moment should not obscure the broader narrative surrounding it. Another aspect of Thomas' legacy emerges when we consider the historical development of Christianity itself. The early Christian movement expanded from a small group of disciples in Judea into a global religion that eventually reached every inhabited continent. Along the way, the stories of the apostles became part of the foundation upon which Christian identity was built, whether through scripture, tradition, liturgy, art, or preaching. Figures such as Thomas continued to influence generations long after their deaths. His story became particularly significant because it addressed challenges faced by later believers. Most Christians would never see Jesus directly. Like Thomas before his encounter with the risen Christ, they would encounter Christianity through testimony handed down by others. In this sense, his experience became representative of a much larger reality. The questions he faced belonged not only to him, but also to countless readers who would come after him. There is also value in reflecting on what the sources do not tell us. Despite centuries of interest, many details about Thomas remain unknown. We do not know where he was born. We do not know the identity of the twin mentioned in his title. We do not possess a detailed account of most of his life. Even the traditions concerning his later ministry contain significant areas of uncertainty. This lack of information may seem disappointing, but it also serves as an important reminder about the nature of ancient history. Historians often work with incomplete evidence. The past rarely survives in perfect detail. Instead, fragments remain, and those fragments must be interpreted carefully. The story of Thomas illustrates this reality well. Some aspects can be established with confidence. Others remain matters of probability, tradition, or speculation. Understanding the difference is essential for responsible historical analysis. Yet, despite these uncertainties, certain conclusions remain remarkably clear. Thomas belonged to the 12 apostles. He followed Jesus during a critical period of history. He appears in several key moments within the Gospel of John. He became associated with one of the most important resurrection narratives in Christian scripture. His name continued to be remembered long after the apostolic age ended. These facts alone secure his place within both Christian history and the history of the ancient world. What makes his story especially compelling is the way it connects personal experience with larger theological questions. Through Thomas, readers encounter themes of loyalty, expectation, loss, testimony, identity, resurrection, and belief. Few figures in the New Testament touch so many major themes while appearing in so few passages. From a documentary perspective, this may be one of the most fascinating aspects of his legacy. Thomas demonstrates how a relatively small number of appearances can carry enormous narrative significance. The influence of a historical figure is not always measured by the quantity of surviving information. Sometimes it is measured by the importance of the moments in which that figure appears. As the Gospel of John draws toward its conclusion, Thomas ultimately stands as a witness to the central claim around which the entire narrative revolves. The story begins with questions concerning the identity of Jesus and ends with one of the clearest responses offered by any disciple. That response became part of the foundation upon which later Christian theology was built. Whether viewed from the perspective of history, literature, theology, or religious tradition, Thomas occupies a unique place within the Christian story. The historical Thomas remains partially hidden from us, separated by centuries and limited sources. Yet the evidence that survives reveals a disciple who stood at the center of some of the most important moments in the New Testament. His journey intersects with the major themes of the Gospel of John and continues to invite reflection nearly 2,000 years later. In the end, the most enduring legacy of Thomas is not a stereotype, a nickname, or a single episode. It is the lasting impact of a disciple whose story became woven into one of the most influential narratives in human history.